Welcome to Due Process. This is Trevor Wadden. Today I'll be speaking with Professor Kathryn Campbell about the issue of wrongful convictions in Canada. Kathryn teaches criminology at the University of Ottawa. She received her PhD in criminology from the University of Montreal and received her LLB from McGill University. Kathryn's research covers several areas, including animals in the law, indigenous justice, and youth justice. The majority of Kathryn's research has centered on miscarriages of justice and wrongful convictions, which includes commentary on how to prevent such convictions, analysis of problematic evidence, and advocating for appropriate schemes of exoneration and compensation for those wrongfully convicted. In addition to her academic schedule, Kathryn is the director of Innocence Ottawa, a pro bono and student-run innocence project that helps the wrongfully convicted apply for conviction review to the Minister of Justice. Kathryn is also the author of Miscarriages of Justice in Canada, Causes, Responses, Remedies, a 2018 publication that has been a great resource for me, Kathryn, in reviewing and researching the area of wrongful convictions in Canada. So thank you for coming on to the show and speaking with us today.
It's my pleasure, Trevor, and thanks for the invitation and the promotion of my book.
No problem. It's an excellent book, and there's so much good information in it. So I definitely encourage people to pick it up. And we'll be linking in our show notes to the book as well, so people can find it easily. So Kathryn, we'll jump right into it, and I'll start with a general question. I know you've indicated to me in our chat off recording here that you could talk about wrongful convictions for hours and hours. What drew you to the area of wrongful convictions, and why has that been a passion area for you?
Well, I think as a criminology professor and a lawyer, I think injustice more generally is very interesting to me, and it's frustrating that, we have this wonderful democratic country, but we have so many areas where people are not treated fairly. And my doctoral research looked at violence against women like over 20 years ago, and I evolved looking at issues affecting youth in the criminal justice system, and then indigenous people and how mistreated they are in our criminal justice system. But I talk about this in the introduction to my book. There was the film Hurricane about Reuben Carter and his wrongful conviction for triple homicide in New Jersey in the 60s anyway. And I was watching the excellent film with Denzel Washington, and I remember the scene in the courtroom when he's found guilty for this murder that he had absolutely nothing to do with. And I was imagining what that would feel like and the horror of that. And I think that sort of got me on that track. And that was in the early 2000s. And there was really not a lot going on in Canada at that point around this topic. And another colleague, Miriam Denoff, who's at McGill now, we decided to host a conference, and it was the first one of its kind in Canada. And we had a full day where we had the wrongly convicted come, we had lawyers come, people from Department of Justice, and it was very well attended. And we published a special issue in a Canadian Journal of Criminology following that. And I guess it's just snowballed from there. I became very, very interested in it. And it's just, in some cases, it's so blatantly obvious that a mistake has been made, and also so difficult to overturn. So I guess it became a lifelong interest following that conference, actually.
Okay. And when was that conference, Kathryn?
2002, almost 20 years ago. Yeah.
Before that, there didn't seem to be a lot of discussion in Canada?
Not in Canada, no.
Oh.
A little bit, but I think now there's so much. It's amazing. I'm so pleased that you have a podcast about a possible wrongful conviction, that there's certainly far more interest in it. And I think not only that, a belief that it actually can happen, because I think one of the difficulties is that many people would say, oh no, the justice system, earlier on anyway, the justice system can't make these kinds of errors. That doesn't happen. There's too many checks and balances in place, but we know that that's not true now. And I think more and more people are believing that. So that's a good thing. I think that's come out of not only the academic interest, but the public interest in media, et cetera, around these cases.
Right. And certainly the more attention that this topic gets, the more interest in preventative measures that can come into play.
Right.
And Kathryn, just so our listeners are on the same page, can you just provide a basic definition? I know it's kind of seems self-explanatory here, but what a wrongful conviction is?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you say that it's self-explanatory, because I think a lot of people have a different conception of that. I kind of follow Clive Walker. He's a legal professor in England who wrote some of the first books on the topic in the UK around the number of wrongful convictions over Irish terrorist cases in the 70s in the UK. And he defines it in a really, really broad way. And he defines miscarriages of justice, in a broad way. And wrongful conviction is one of those. And that's like, in a, I guess, a traditional sense, in the way many Americans look at it, it's like a wrong man case. So the person didn't commit the crime, but they've been convicted and they've been arrested and tried and convicted of it regardless. And that's true. That is one definition, but there are lots of other kinds of miscarriages of justice too, where the law is problematic or the evidence is problematic. And so I think it's not so easy to define it. But for me, and often in writing, people write about it. They talk about miscarriages of justice and wrongful convictions being the same thing. But for me, a wrongful conviction is one form of miscarriage of justice. What about a wrongful acquittal? That's a miscarriage of justice too, right? So I think the term is broad, but for our purposes, I understand that we're looking at wrongful, sort of wrong man type of wrongful convictions. Or even like there are some cases though too where a crime wasn't even committed, right? So that he said, she said sexual assault cases. Right. Those are, there's no crime sometimes, but a crime is created or invented. Or there's like in many Canadian cases, I'm thinking of Bill Mullins-Johnson's case where he was convicted of murdering his niece and sexually assaulting his 4-year-old niece, when in fact no crime occurred at all. She died of natural causes. So that's a wrongful conviction too, right?
Right.
It's a broad term.
Right. Glad you provided that distinction for us, because I do hear a lot about how, wrongful convictions and miscarriages of justice, the two terms seem to be used interchangeably. But as you point out, there's wrongful convictions kind of falls under the umbrella of miscarriages of justice. Can you just provide an explanation or a distinction between what is meant by factual and legal innocence?
Well, you could be factually innocent and still be convicted, right? Like, but if you could be legally innocent and guilty. Do you know what I mean? So to me, a legal innocence is a determination of a court. Right, although they don't use the term innocence, our system doesn't use that term, but that would be my distinction. So you did, factually you didn't do it, or legally you were found innocent, or so you're acquitted. So I think that would be one way to make that distinction.
And they would both be considered wrongful convictions in your view?
Depending on the circumstances, yeah.
Okay. And Kathryn, I want to try to give listeners an idea of the frequency of wrongful convictions in Canada. And I know this is a difficult thing to do. And as you said, there wasn't a lot of discussion about wrongful convictions when you got involved. But is it possible to determine how often wrongful convictions are occurring in Canada?
I mean, a lot of your questions are great, Trevor, because clearly you have read my book, because these are some of the things I've talked about. But no, it's really hard, because the only time we know about it is when they're overturned. That's the only time we can count them realistically. We can have a feeling or even a certainty, but unless they're overturned, they're not considered a wrongful conviction. So it's not. So if I give you a number, it's an inaccurate number. Like if you look on the American National Registry of Wrongful Convictions, I think they're up around 25 or 2,700 known exonerations. So I guess an exoneration is how you would determine it. And in the Innocence Project in New York City, there's around 330, but those are only DNA cases, right? And so that's a very narrow type of exoneration where there's physical evidence left in the crime scene that you can determine that a person was the wrong man, if you want. Now in Canada, when I was researching my book in 2016, 2017, I included an appendix where I looked at 70 cases, and that was from Stephen Truscott in 1959 up to 2016 or 17 when I stopped. And there have since been other exonerations. Glenn Assoon is one case that comes to mind. Connie Oakes, another case that I didn't include, that I hope to do a second edition, and I'll expand that. But sadly, we don't have a national registry, because that would be a really great resource for people studying this topic to go and look at, who's been wrongly convicted, what were the factors, etc. So I looked at 70 cases, but some of the American research, particularly Marv Zalman, he comes up with a figure looking at a number of different studies that in the US, between 0.5 and 1% of all felony convictions are in error. So in the US, that's probably 10,000 cases a year. And in Canada, that would probably be about 800 cases a year. So there's 500 to 800 cases a year. So is that the right number? I don't know. But I think it's probably a lot higher than we can ever really know.
Right. But it also it's quite difficult, and Kathryn, correct me if I'm wrong, but just the amount of effort, time, and money that you would need to get one of these overturned.
Yeah, it's years, decades sometimes, right? So
Right.
I mean, and also too, just to get back to the numbers question. So what if we said that every successful appeal was a wrongful conviction? Then we're talking about tens of thousands of cases, right? So, or Justice Hickman, who was the commissioner for the Donald Marshall inquiry in 1989-90. And if you want to look at any commission of inquiry in terms of thoroughness and detail, that would be the one, because there's like 9 volumes, I think. But one of the things that he said, because he wrote an article for a special issue of a journal I edited, and he said, that's not a wrongful conviction. That's the court just getting it right the second time around, correcting its own mistake. I don't know if that's true. There are other people that think differently. But the original question was
just whether it was possible to get a sense of how often or how frequent this issue is in Canada.
Yeah, I think that's really difficult. I have details about 70 cases, but as I said, there's been other ones that have come to my attention since I published the book. But it is very, very hard to overturn. And if a table in there where I talk about how long from actual conviction to getting a compensation, which is another issue we can talk about in a minute, and it's usually decades. Right. Because, people don't listen, right? People aren't interested in something you didn't do, as Gord Downey says in the song Wheat Kings, which is about David Milgaard's wrong. And it's true. They're not interested in something you didn't do, right? People don't believe you. And this idea, and I've worked in corrections at the beginning of my career in a medium security prison, and people would say to me, oh, everyone in jail thinks they're innocent. And that certainly wasn't my experience. I can think of maybe one man who would say to me, yeah, I didn't do it, but I don't think that's true. I think a lot of people are, in jail, certainly in jail, they're not going around expounding that they're not guilty. I think people who are able to hold on to that innocence for a long period of time, I mean, that's pretty impressive. And I don't know why you would do that falsely.
So your experience in jail then, Kathryn, are you saying that people are just kind of accepting that that's their reality, or the ones that are sticking to their innocence are probably more likely to be innocent if they're sticking to it? Yeah.
That was my experience from a while ago. And we get a lot, and I run an innocence project at University of Ottawa, and we get a lot of letters in a year from different incarcerated people. But we have a very narrow mandate, and I guess I could talk about that in a minute. But some people, they're not happy with their sentence, right? And that's not a wrongful conviction. Or they have a second-degree murder when they say it should be a manslaughter conviction. That's not innocence. It's not a wrongful conviction, maybe a problematic sentence. Or we're getting more and more requests from people who have a dangerous offender designation, where they feel like this is not accurate. So anyway, just to say, yeah, I think people who hold on to their innocence for a long time are most likely, in my experience, innocent.
Okay. And so trying to find out how regular this issue is happening in Canada is difficult. But do we know anything about the people most at risk to experience wrongful convictions? Has your research revealed anything to that?
I think people who are more marginalized in a society are going to be more at risk. People who don't have any power or influence. So somebody who can't afford a good lawyer, somebody who'll take a guilty plea to a lesser sentence because they can't afford the expense of a trial, and they know that the likelihood of them being acquitted is very low. So somebody who's more marginalized, maybe due to people who are racialized, indigenous people, I think, are far more likely to be. Although what's interesting, and this is kind of a contradiction, is that if you look at the 70 cases that I came up with, there's not a lot of indigenous people who are exonerated. So what does that mean? Well, I think I'd love to study that. I haven't, but I think perhaps it may have more to do with the lack of trust many indigenous people have with the criminal justice system getting it right. Okay. I just haven't found them, and maybe they're not coming forward, because I can think of a handful only that I was able to find.
So in terms of trying to arrive at a number or percentage, I think some people who are advocates of our justice system and the good job that the justice system does will say, well, we'll try to point to that, saying, look, there's only been so many cases that we're aware of. Our justice system is doing a good job. Is it important to arrive at a figure, or is it the fact that it's happening at all enough to justify researching it and taking these preventative steps?
Well, I think you've answered your own question. I would think that it happens frequently enough that we should be looking at it, because when it does happen, what does that say about our criminal justice system, right? Like that it's not very legitimate if it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. I mean, I live in Montreal, and you might have heard about the Camara case that happened within the past couple of weeks, and a Black man who was wrongly accused, pulled out of a car by police officers. One officer stood on his head, or put his foot on his head, and was a Black man, and was arrested and jailed for, I think, a week, and then was released, but he was wrongfully accused. And I was kind of interested in following that case, because I thought, wow, the fact that the mistake was corrected early on was certainly to his benefit, but that doesn't happen all the time, right? So often it would be maybe at trial, or even, who knows, down the road. But and I think there might have been a question of some racial profiling going on, but again, that was a crime against a police officer, and being one, I would assume that police take those kinds of things very, very seriously. I mean, not more seriously than anything else, but I mean, your job is to be out and enforcing the law. And then if one of your own colleagues is victimized, I'm sure it's problematic. But yeah, I don't think it matters how much it happens, because I think we need, although I guess some people would say, well, if it's not occurring very often, I don't think people are saying that anymore. I think that's happening less and less,
Which might be a sign that we're moving in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And I'll get your thoughts near the end of our conversation about how optimistic you are, the steps that we're taking and the direction that we're headed in. But you did mention the legitimacy factor. And Kathryn, I recognize that there's philosophers and people such as yourself can have long discussions about how to define legitimacy in this context. But in the scope of our conversation, we'll equate legitimacy with society's confidence and trust in the justice system's ability to make determinations about a person's guilt or innocence. So specifically, how, in your opinion, do wrongful convictions affect the legitimacy of the criminal justice system?
Well, I think they call it into question, right? Because if the police and the Crown and the courts are accusing and, I guess, charging, trying and convicting people for crimes that they didn't commit, then I think that detracts from people's faith in the system overall, right? I mean, I think we're probably at a period in history where the legitimacy maybe of police is pretty low right now, or given George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and all of those things. So I think, in our 24-hour news cycle of the way society works, like anything can be taken out of context as well and misconstrued. But I think at the same time, it's made criminal justice officials, police, Crown, courts more accountable. And so I think I see a sea change in that sense. But at the same time, I don't think, it's particularly with policing that I think the legitimacy question is more evident. And for policing as well, as I'm sure you're aware, they're the first point of entry in the criminal justice system. So the error made there can be compounded at many other steps along the way. So I think in that sense, the police have a very big role to play with respect to legitimacy.
In terms of some of the different problematic factors that you see in the majority of these wrongful conviction cases, Kathryn, I wanted to discuss just briefly. It's beyond the scope of our conversation today to really get into each and every one of these, because there's a lot of frequent hallmarks that you see in a lot of these cases, and your book goes through in great detail. And it's again, would encourage people to get your book to look at these different elements. But to give listeners an idea, some of the common things that we see in these wrongful convictions are faulty eyewitness testimony, false confessions, jailhouse informers, reliance on experts and faulty science, investigative tunnel vision, improper disclosure, and a reliance on demeanor evidence. And in a lot of these cases, they exhibit multiple of these factors. But one aspect I did want to touch on is the environment or climate in which these factors may arise. Based on your research, Kathryn, have you seen any certain types of crimes or public pressures that make these factors more likely?
Well, I think the most common factor is eyewitness misidentification, and I think that could happen in any crime, right? Like, what evidence is the Crown bringing forward, the police and Crown bringing forward for a particular charge? And often it's an eyewitness, and they're notoriously unreliable. I mean, I think we think about our memories being like a video camera, but it's not. And I mean, the courts are recognizing this to a certain extent, but that's a problem in any kind of wrongful conviction. But what, in terms of, say, the more common ones, usually they're homicide cases where the police are under pressure to get a conviction and to get it fast. I mean, talk about legitimacy. So you have an unsolved murder. So what kind of pressure is there? Well, I assume there would be pressure on the police to find someone. And then things like tunnel vision affect who the police and Crown go after, right? So they may find evidence for a person initially, and then every other piece of evidence that comes by is perhaps looked at or viewed in a certain way to confirm their initial suspicion, and exculpatory evidence that looks somewhere else is not given the same consideration. I think that kind of starts snowballing, and you may end up with the wrong person for the crime. But certainly it's usually high profile cases where there's the child victim, even worse, right? And the person being accused is often someone who doesn't have, it's not, the wealthy people in society, right? It's people who are marginalized by poverty, by mental illness, by race, those kinds of things.
Okay, and certainly, as you said, there's these high-profile cases. There are pressures on police to solve them, homicide cases in particular. This leads into the next topic I wanted to talk to you about, was just the human element of our system in general. Hard pressed to find someone to say a wrongful conviction is a good outcome. But in terms of looking maybe at the other side, what people may say is that the justice system is a very human system. It's imperfect. For the most part, we do a good job of convicting people who are actually guilty of these crimes. But when you look at, for instance, a major case, there's lots of people involved, lots of humans, starting with the police. You go into forensic experts, Crown, defense, witnesses, judge, and jury. And at the end of the day, there's the consensus is that most of these people, well, all of them, bring their own implicit and explicit biases with them, right? So to expect a perfect system is not realistic. So put another way, so long as decisions about guilt and innocence remain in the hands of humans, wrongful convictions are inevitable. And some may say that this is simply the cost of ensuring an otherwise efficient justice system, in particular, providing closure and finality. So that's a very long-winded preamble here, Kathryn, but are wrongful convictions an acceptable cost to ensure our justice system continues to run efficiently?
I can't agree with that. Just because I've met so many wrongly convicted people over the years, their families, like I think we have to strive to get it right all the time. Like it's not an area where you can make mistakes and it be okay, because the outcome is, and the cost is so high. I understand that point of view. It's not mine, okay? Because I think that we can do better. At every point in the system, we can do better. Can we be perfect? Probably not, but we can certainly be better. So I think in that way, I don't think there is a cost that I would be okay with. Just because it's just so huge, when an individual is taken away, and their reputation, their family, it's just so huge that I can't agree with that. Yeah.
And I share it. I wish and hope we can exist in a world where wrongful convictions don't happen, but you wouldn't believe it's naive to hope for such a world.
Maybe, but maybe it's idealistic. And what I appreciate being a professor is that I'm a bit more cynical than my students coming in, but I'll just give you an example. I was talking to a law student who's in my Innocence project last week, and we have this case of a man who was accused of a attempted murder. And we just got the trial transcripts, and it's quite clear the judge was very dismissive of any evidence that was brought forward in this man's defense. And it just it sounded, from her position, it sounded like he just wanted to get it over with, and the man was found guilty. And she said, this makes me so angry, like this poor man and what's happened to him. And I said, well, I'm glad that she says, well, how can we let this continue to happen? And I said, I'm glad that you feel that way. To me, it's like par for the course, but for her, it's like it made her so angry she wanted to act. And I said, that idealism is really important, because that's how change happens. So maybe I'm a realist. I know it's not a perfect system, but I'd like to think I'm a bit of an idealist as well, that I want to work towards making it better.
And that's important, making progress, working to something
right.
better. You've written a lot about post-conviction review and compensation. I want to get into that a little bit now. Because it's a human system, maybe wrongful convictions will be an inevitable thing that we have to deal with. But post-conviction review and compensation could be a way that we can at least lift legitimacy of our justice system, or help to improve the legitimacy of our justice system. Can you first explain what post-conviction review is?
Sure. Post-conviction review is in the criminal code under section 696. What it does is it allows an individual who believes they've been wrongly convicted the opportunity to have their case re-examined. But it's very tightly circumscribed. So what happens is that we have a criminal conviction review group that functions out of the Department of Justice in Ottawa, and they can take applications for what's called conviction review. But because it's so circumscribed, very few people meet the parameters that are necessary for that level of review. So an individual would have to have exhausted all their appeals before they could ask for review of their conviction. So first instance, a court of appeals, Supreme Court, right? And they would have to come out with new and significant information that had not previously been considered by the court that was reasonably capable of belief. So if there was something that had been already discussed on appeal, doesn't matter, you can't bring it up again. So it has to be new, and it could be things like a recantation or DNA evidence or like a small list of what they could consider. But what's problematic about this is that by the time somebody gets to conviction review, there's probably been at least a decade that's passed, right? So they've been tried, convicted, they're in jail, they go to appeal, court of appeal in their province, and they go to the Supreme Court, and then they can apply for conviction review. Although there's been some variation on that. Some people can apply after their court of appeal request has been denied. But it's a very high bar. So what happens is very few people are able to meet that. So one of the problems, because our Innocence Project, that's what we help people do. We're not a law firm, we're not, like I'm a licensed lawyer, but we're not doing appeals. We're doing conviction review. So we have to find new evidence. And, when a decade has passed, 2 decades have passed, it's a long time for people to remember things. So we ask our applicants, so anyone who wants to do conviction review, they have to find that information, and it makes it very hard. And the CCRG, the Criminal Conviction Review Group in Ottawa, they have, I think, maybe 3 or 6 lawyers that work on these cases, and they take years. Like we have in our Innocence Project, we have one case in front of them now that we submitted in June 2019. We don't have a response yet. It's almost 2 years, and this man is still in jail. He's been in jail for 13 years for a murder that clearly he did not commit. So I think it's a very problematic system. Now, a lot of people are asking for an independent system because this is still attached to our Department of Justice. And one very famous voice in this debate is David Milgaards, who I'm sure everyone's familiar with. And he's constantly going into the media and saying, we need this to happen. We need to have an independent model outside government. Well, I don't think it's the panacea that everyone thinks it is, but I think it would be better than what we have. And I know Trudeau, that was part of the Department of Justice mandate, certainly in the second election, that they were going to look at this and give this very serious consideration, but I haven't seen that. I haven't seen anything about that since that time. So that's conviction review.
Okay. And the lawyers that you mentioned that are on the Criminal Conviction Review Group, they're lawyers that would be employees of the Department of Justice?
Yeah. So one of the issues around that is, and what I've argued in other articles I've written, is that it's people who work for the Department of Justice, essentially overseeing work of other members of the department, of attorneys general of different provinces, right? And I think there's also, because of the issue of finality, people don't always like to go back and question what went on, right? So they do their investigation, which could take a long, long time, and they have to compile all this information. But I mean, for my project, we send them a very tight application with all the information that they need, but then they have to investigate it. And once they've investigated it and they make a decision, and then they'll make a recommendation to the minister. And then it's the minister who ultimately decides that it's a man now, if he's satisfied that a miscarriage of justice likely occurred, then he can turn around and actually, what usually happens is he has other options, but what usually happens is he refers the case back to Court of Appeal on a question. And some research that I did recently, I looked at a number of cases that went to conviction review. And what I found is that the bar is very high for them to investigate your case. But if they decide to investigate it and recommend to the minister to go send it back to the Court of Appeal, the chances of your case being overturned are very high. So let's say I think I looked at 16 cases, and of those 16, 15 of them were acquitted at the Court of Appeal level. So that's pretty good. But the number of cases they get and the number of applications, like it's probably, like I don't have the stats right here, but it's a very low number from the actual people who go to them and say, review my conviction, versus the actual number who are acquitted. Is that clear?
Yeah, that's clear. Why do you think there's so few applications? Just because of how onerous it is?
Partly, I think. And you can have a summary conviction reviewed at this level too, like who would, maybe many people won't do that, right? So I think it takes so much time, and that people just want to get on with their lives. They don't, you know what, it's like, okay, I just want to forget about that part of my life. I think that happens a lot. But if you compare, like in the UK, I mean, it's a much bigger country population wise, their system, which is independent, people point to that and say, well, it's independent and they deal with so many more cases, and they do, like probably 10 times what we do. But I don't think it's perfect either. There's problems with it too, because again, none of these commissions, whether it's ours or the one in the UK, they can't make a decision on a case. Only a court can, right? Okay. So court in North Carolina, there's an independent commission that makes decisions about cases, but they don't deal with a lot of cases either. Like we've had people approach us and say, well, you know, I didn't mean to kill her, or like cases of murder versus manslaughter, secondary. And you know what, unless the courts don't care about that, if there's not information enough on an appeal to quash that, there's nothing you can do on conviction review. It's really about a miscarriage of justice.
So you mentioned this principle of finality, and I've seen it a few times. That's one common thing that's put forward to say that, you know, at some point we need to put this case to bed and move on to the next one. What do you think of that argument and that principle in general?
I mean, I understand why it's there. You know, you don't want to constantly relitigate the same issues, but I think when you're talking about people's freedom, I think courts need to be more open to looking at what factors we use to convict people, because the science and certainly the research now is pointing to all those areas you mentioned earlier as causing wrongful convictions that are highly problematic areas. And, you know, courts need to, I think, examine them in more detail. But the principle of finality stops, I think, sometimes even at an appeal level. So if you have a conviction and then an appeals court, they're not hearing the evidence, right? They're just hearing the arguments, and there's deference to the trial judge because they hear the actual evidence. So I think that principle operates there as well. So there's maybe different points in the system where it stops the relitigation or the review of cases.
Okay. In reading about these problematic evidentiary issues, you read the social science evidence in particular. We'll just use the example of demeanor evidence or nonverbal cues. There seems to be a growing consensus that evaluating someone's guilt, or if they're lying, by using or even considering nonverbal cues is not a great strategy. No. But it seems like courts are still reluctant to admit such social science evidence. Have you thought about that or seen that yourself?
Well, I know our courts will not, in terms of demeanor evidence, I don't know if I can address that directly, except for, like, I know in the Donald Marshall Jr. case, which is a much older wrongful conviction from Nova Scotia that I spoke about earlier, one of the issues in that case was that Donald Marshall Jr. was a Mi'kmaq man, and he was very, very shy in front of the court, didn't want to make eye contact, didn't answer a lot of questions, and that evidence was interpreted as guilt, right? And it's ridiculous. But I know in the United States, they'll allow expert testimony on, say, the unreliability of eyewitness identification evidence. I think those kinds of experts help the court. And I think at the same time, though, you know, you don't necessarily want to get into a battle of experts, but I think it's wrong to assume that legally trained people are going to know the psychological science or the research behind a lot of that stuff. I mean, seasoned judges would definitely, I guess, become used to that, but I think we need scientists, we need researchers to show the courts how mistakes can happen.
Right. And certainly in my reading about it, I've read some critiques of our courts in that there's certain presumptions that are fundamental for courts to operate on, like jury competence and understanding jury instructions and complex legal instructions, and that to question some of these things would almost upturn the legal system in a way, because if you start questioning some of these basic presumptions, it leads to doubt and uncertainty. So I was just interested in getting your thoughts on that. If you've seen that in terms of wrongful convictions, maybe that's partially why some people are so timid or hesitant to discuss it.
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're asking me. Could you?
Well, just in terms of, there's certain presumptions in our legal system where we need these presumptions almost to operate efficiently, or for courts. Like, for example, courts will tell jurors that they can look at someone's demeanor on the stand, and that jurors are able to understand instructions that the judge will give them in their closing instructions to the jury. And I'm just using this as an example. There's a growing body of evidence that I've seen and read that juror comprehension of legal instructions is probably quite poor. And we really don't know because of the jury secrecy laws that exist in Canada. But when you read what courts have to say about jury competence, it's, this is the presumption we presume and we hold that jurors are, but it's almost like they just kind of ignore the social science evidence, or there's a reluctance to look at that evidence.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if there is a parallel there to look at wrongful convictions, where maybe that plays into some of the hesitancy or the timidness in discussing wrongful convictions.
It's quite possible. And I think there's a sense that from the judiciary anyway, and I've seen this in different decisions, of that the jury will make decisions based on common sense. Like, for example, we don't need an expert in this case because it's common sense. But I think that's a misconception of what common sense is. I mean, your average person on the street is not going to know how flawed our memory is, or that a jailhouse informant has a ton of incentives to be lying, right? And I think that's unfortunate. But I think maybe judges, they don't want to have to rely. It costs more. It takes more time, right, to get an expert in, and then you'll have both sides with different experts saying different things. It becomes a battle of experts. You see that in American courts a lot. But I think that could be a large part of it, that they want to avoid that. And there's an erroneous expectation that your jury is filled with people who are going to make commonsensical decisions, and that's not the case, definitely.
Okay, just going back to the post-conviction regime.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but if you could wave a magic wand, what type of system would you like to see implemented in Canada?
I think the system in North Carolina, they have an Innocence Commission. I think that kind of system would work better, because there's like two steps for the post-conviction review system in Canada and the UK, right? So, and there's a similar one in Scotland, Norway, and a new one in New Zealand, actually. But they still rely on the court, right? So the court ultimately makes the decision. But I think the North Carolina model, if I'm not mistaken, and I hosted a conference last year where I had someone come and talk about their model, they make a decision about a case. And so they rely on, it's judges and different people, and it's not made lightly, and they don't make a lot of them, but at least you're avoiding that step. I mean, we have a court system. We rely on our court system. So I think that would be my ultimate fantasy of a better way to do it. But at the same time, if I look at how we do it now, then I think we need to fund it better, because in the UK system, there are hundreds of people that work for the CCRC there, right? And there's ex-police officers, investigators, there are lots of lawyers, there are students. Like I visited in Birmingham where their office is, and it's like a huge, not corporation, but it's, several floors of a building, and people are working quite hard on many of these cases. It's given that we have a handful of lawyers that it takes years. I mean, maybe we're not taking it seriously enough. Even if we're not going to change our model, just give it more money so it can do a better job. It's not, the people that work there work very hard. I know some of them, and they're very people with great integrity, but maybe they just don't have the resources.
So more resources to help.
Unless we're going to go the independent model. But I mean, we looked at this when the criminal code was amended. I believe it was 2002. They examined this possibility. Let's go independent, and they said no. One of the rationales was that we don't have, like the UK has one court of appeal, whereas we have so many. We're a different system, and we don't need that. And at that point, they appointed a special advisor who is now former Justice Morris Fish, right? And they moved their office out of the Department of Justice buildings. So they did some symbolic things. I don't think it functions that well as a part of the Department of Justice.
Okay, just curious, again, if I gave you the magic wand for the system or regime to be set up, would you like to see it or these applications be done at an earlier time? Or would you still want to see them exhausting all their court avenues first?
I haven't thought about that. Think about it out loud, but so if we would like rather have it, what, after first instance court rather than a court of appeal have, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking, I don't know, I maybe misread this, but I think I've read some, maybe it was in Colorado, where there's just a standing committee that they'll revisit convictions and look at certain evidence and make sure that the convictions still meet are legitimate.
Units?
Yeah, conviction integrity units.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe having, without the need of people to apply or to submit an application.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I know there's one in New York and there was one in New Orleans. I've done some research in New Orleans, which they've had a lot of wrongful convictions come out of that one parish, that one city.
Right.
And they had a conviction integrity unit there that they set up and then it folded. It's only around for a couple of years, but that might be an interesting way. I hadn't thought of that in the Canadian context. That might be.
I haven't looked into it all too closely. I remember reading about it and I thought that was interesting that they're revisiting these convictions earlier on and sometimes without any application from the actual convicted person. But just something
I do know one of the problems though with those, Trevor, is that you have to have I guess it's a district attorney there, but a prosecutorial office, it's open to looking at error. And I think that's one of the big problems with wrongful convictions is people don't like to admit they've made a mistake. And also making a mistake, admitting your own mistake, right? I mean, it's hard. And so I just think our system is so overloaded. The fact that we have this Jordan rule, I mean, that to me says a lot about how we don't have enough courts or crowns or judges. I don't know. There's a problem.
Yeah. Obviously Jordan was needed because some of these cases were just lagging on and on and on. But at the same time, it certainly has put a lot of pressure on what I've seen as under-resourced crown. But that's interesting about your comment about not admitting that you're wrong or making mistakes. I'm wondering if there's a way we can somehow incentivize keeping an open mind, or if you do admit that, okay, yeah, we messed up on this, let's try to correct the issue, how we can incentivize that. Because I think in society today, there's a lot of cases where if you admit you're wrong or that you made an error, it can often mean that you're going to lose your job or not get promoted. So I don't know if that's not an easy question. That's more of a philosophical thing. But in terms of how we can incentivize even police officers and crown culture in general to say, okay, we're not perfect, we're human, we've made mistakes, but let's try to correct it and learn from those mistakes. That's something I've thought about, how we can better incentivize it.
I think maybe hearing stories too of wrongly convicted people and how it affects them is helpful, because I know at this conference I hosted in 2019 when the world was normal, it was about an Israel-Canada wrongful conviction conference. And the last day we had a panel with 2 Supreme Court judges, one from Israel, one from Canada, and 2 wrongly convicted people. And the wrongly convicted people told their stories, and then the judges were talking about their roles. And the judge from Israel was so blown away. He said afterwards, I've never heard a story like that in my life. And he was very open to hearing it and to understanding what that experience was like. And I think when you have that in your mind too, like, it's constantly on my mind because I've studied it for 18, almost 20 years. But I think for police, for crowns, for judges, for defense lawyers, I think, some of the training that we have to do as lawyers and police too, I'm sure yearly, maybe should be around that to sort of help. Because how do you incentivize someone? By punishing them? Well, then it becomes fear and then there's a way around it, right? So, but maybe just by educating them, like this is what happens when we cut corners, and this is what happens when we don't follow all angles. You ruin someone's life. So I think maybe in that way, like a more of a gentle kind of turning them in a certain direction rather than firing them, let's say. I don't know.
Right. And I'm just thinking out loud now too, that I'm sure some of the reluctance to openly say, oh, yeah, we made a mistake may have to do with civil repercussions as well. Sure. But I do think it's something in general our society needs to look at.
Can I just add one thing too?
Yeah.
Like when we had the conference in 2002, Miriam Denov and I, we decided we were going to interview wrongly convicted people. And it's interesting because not since then, I think there's only been a couple of other studies where wrongly convicted people have actually been interviewed about their experience. And one of the things that they all said to us, what they wanted, was they wanted somebody to say that they were sorry. They made a mistake and that they were sorry. And I mean, is it about forgiveness? It's not really, it wasn't about that. It was more like, I don't know, vindication on some level. And I found that very interesting. And I think that may be, besides the whole idea of litigation attached to admitting error, I think that's an important thing. And sometimes you'll see that with a judge who will turn to it, at an acquittal point of a court of appeal saying, I'm really sorry for what happened to you. And I think that's a very symbolic, but it's very important.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I do want to, in a moment, I'll ask more about your experiences in interviewing the wrongfully convicted and seeing the effects up close. But just one final question on post-conviction review. If we could create a system of post-conviction review that was more responsive, that was able to have more resources, money, and people staffing to look at these cases, do you think that would help build more confidence and legitimacy to our justice system? Yeah. Even in the face of, yes, we know wrongful convictions happen, but we're taking steps after the fact to correct those errors.
Yeah, I think it would. I think it would go a long way. And something that was advertised, people knew about it, because I don't know if your average person in jail even knows about this process. I mean, it's so daunting, though, when you think about what you have to do and how long it takes. And like, we often get letters from people who feel they've been wrongly convicted, but they haven't even appealed their sentence or their case, right? And so can't do anything. So yeah. I think in that sense, it definitely would.
So we'll switch now and talk about the impact on the individual for wrongful convicted. And I appreciate that could be hours and hours of discussion as well. But I did want to give listeners some understanding of the up close and personal. And I trust that many listeners will intuitively understand the psychological and physical harm that would come with a wrongful conviction. But I'm just wondering if you can share some comments about your experiences with dealing with some of these people.
I think that the wrongly convicted have a very deep sense of injustice, right? And one of the things we found in our study was that they became, any kind of injustice they saw following their exoneration or not, or being released from jail, would infuriate them because they had been victimized themselves so horribly. And also that the whole idea that most people think that it could never happen to them, right? Like it could never happen to them, and they're protected, or they would never confess to something they didn't do, or something along those lines. So I think at the first conference that we had two gentlemen there, probably people that are not common names in Canada, who were wrongly convicted. A man named Jamie Nelson from Ontario, and a man named Christopher Bates from Quebec. And when Christopher was talking, now he's a lovely man, and he had been wrongly convicted for a murder of a shopkeeper in this small town in Quebec in the early 90s. And he talked about police abuse that you wouldn't, like, you'd think, what is this, a third world country he's talking about? Where he was tortured, he was denied food, he was denied a toilet. And at one point, you could have heard a pin drop when he was telling his story, and how the police pulled his pants down and squeezed his testicles until he signed this document. And this was in 1992 or 93 in Quebec. And he ended up serving 6 years for that murder and got out. Innocence Canada was helping him. He got out and he was appealing it. But the court said to him, we'll give you time served if you admit guilt for this robbery. And he was like, well, I didn't rob anybody. I'm not going to do that. But as it came closer to, just to give you an idea, he had 4 children. He was in a prison in Baie-Comeau, so far away from his family. He hardly ever saw them. He said to me and my colleague, I knew I was going to be in jail for the rest of my life because I was never going to admit to something I didn't do, right? So when it came, and that's a problem for the wrongly convicted. They're in jail or they're in prison, and then their parole date comes up and they have to talk about remorse and what they worked on their crime, and then therefore they're eligible for parole. Well, that was Chris's issue, was like, I'm never going to get out because I'm never going to say that I worked on this because I didn't do anything. And so sadly for him, he had so much PTSD from being in this maximum security prison that when he was out on appeal, he took the guilty plea because he said, I realized my lawyer didn't have a clue of what was going on, and I was going to end up back in jail if I went to trial. So I just said, fine, I'll take it. And he's been trying to overturn that plea for, I don't know how long, over 15 years, and he hasn't been able to. So I think, the psychological effects, Romeo Filion, he ended up being in jail for wrongful murder, a murder that he didn't commit, for over 30 years. And he died shortly after he got out, before he could be exonerated. But the psychological impact, like Jamie Nelson, his children were placed in social welfare and in children's aid. They were taken away from his wife because she couldn't take care of them. He had a job as a chef. He lost that. His reputation was about a sexual assault accusation that never happened. And I think the impact is huge. Like Adrian Grounds, a psychiatrist in the UK, has done a study on this, where he looked at the long-term impact of wrongful conviction, PTSD. Very, very common. And I think prison's a horrible place for anybody. But imagine if you haven't done anything and you're in there, like how much worse that would be for you. That alone should make us be more vigilant, I think.
Right. And yeah, it's tough to even think about. Going to prison for a crime you didn't commit is a nightmare. And recently in British Columbia, the Yibis case, he was convicted for allegedly killing his stepchildren that he had adopted. And recently, new fire evidence and science came out to suggest that no, it was just an accident. But I mean, to have that over your head your entire life, go to prison and have that reputation, I mean, I can't even imagine. It's tough to fathom.
And, the Cameron Todd Willingham case, he just reminded me of it with this, is an American Texan case. The man was put to death for based on false arson science, that he murdered his children. And now we know that was clearly a mistake, but he's dead. Like, what are you going to do with that, right? Yeah.
Certainly a nightmare situation. We talked about post-conviction review and how that might help the legitimacy after the fact for our justice system. Why do you think compensation is such an important key to maintaining legitimacy in our justice system once a wrongful conviction is discovered?
Well, it's a state accepting responsibility for the errors that it made. I think that's a really important thing. And I wrote an article about this, how to reestablish legitimacy once this has happened. And I think compensation is a really important step, but sadly, it's not automatic, right? We have guidelines. We don't have statute. I think we should have a statute, a law that says, if you've been wrongly convicted for this many years, this is how much money you'll get. Like, of the cases in my book, I think only 43% were compensated out of the 70 cases. And it took many, many years for most of them. And I think once you have been wrongly convicted and exonerated, what do you do with yourself too? Like, do you still have your family involved in your life? How do you pay your rent? How do you get a job? How do you apply for welfare? Like, all of those things could be mitigated by automatic compensation through statute. And I think that's important. It's really a political thing right now, compensation. It has a lot to do with who you are, how much knowledge there is about your case, politician who might take on your story. So I think we really need to rethink that as well. Like, the UK has statute. Like, it's not without problems, but it's, at least people know that they're not going to be homeless, once they're out of jail.
So as it currently stands, how does someone access compensation in Canada?
It's not automatic. I believe that there has to be a hearing to decide whether or not you deserve compensation. But to get the hearing, I believe you need to, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe you need to have a politician who would support that application, and then it goes into a hearing. It's not a trial in that sense. Right. Then that decision would have to be made at that point. And it seems to me it's mainly the high profile cases that are the ones that get compensated most of the time. And, I was at a meeting, and it was at least 10 years ago, where the Department of Justice invited me to Toronto, and we were looking at revamping the guidelines, which were written in 1986, right? So they're old. And there was Justice Corey was there from the Supreme Court, and there were different people, Department of Justice, some other lawyers, and we talked about the need for compensation to be re-examined, but nothing came of that. And one issue that came out that's, I think, is highly problematic is the idea of room and board, and that sometimes is subtracted from compensation amounts in the UK. And I remember there was a man that I was at the 10th anniversary of the UK one, the CCRC. It was, I think, the 10th anniversary. And there was a man there named Paddy Hill who had been wrongly convicted of a terrorism case. And he was so angry. This is many years later. And he had gotten compensation, but they had subtracted room and board from it. And they're talking about it in the Canadian context. And I was like, you can't be serious. Like, this is,
So this hearing, you need someone to be a champion of your cause. Yeah. And then I guess their other avenue could be to try to seek a civil lawsuit.
Right. Also very hard.
Yeah. And I do think it's a consensus that most of the time the people involved in investigating and prosecuting these crimes they're not evil people. They fall into some of these pitfalls, but they're people that got into the profession. There's always bad apples, of course, but they're people that got into policing or being a lawyer or crown because their intentions were to serve the public. But we're human and we can fall victim to some of these pitfalls and evidentiary issues, which is why it's so difficult in civil cases to prove malicious investigation. So I become mindful of your time now, Kathryn, but I want to get your thoughts on the direction we're heading and how optimistic you are that we're moving in a good direction. But I did want to read a quote from a 2005 article you authored. Quote, not long ago, to claim that an innocent person had been imprisoned was audacious, even risky, a proposition that was close to unprovable. Now the fabric of false guilt is laid bare. Sometimes eyewitnesses make mistakes, snitches tell lies, confessions are coerced or fabricated, racism trumps the truth, lab tests are rigged, defense lawyers sleep, prosecutors lie. And this is a quote you borrowed, I believe, from US scholars. But my purpose in referencing that quote is twofold. We've already talked about some of these pitfalls and hallmarks, and it's scary that they happen and continue to happen. But at the same time, the quote does suggest that we are making some progress. We've emerged from a climate where to even discuss wrongful convictions was forbidden, to where we're now able to recognize that some of these evidentiary and problematic issues continue to rear their head in these cases. And even in the last 15 years or so, Department of Justice in Canada has commissioned a number of papers, 3 or 4 papers, where they discuss wrongful convictions in part. They make recommendations. Some of these recommendations now are being implemented in Crown desk books and policies. Police departments are starting to incorporate different types of training and major case management, different steps that they're trying to take to avoid some of these wrongful convictions and issues that we see again and again. But do you think we are headed in the right direction in that we're making steps to improve and prevent these wrongful convictions?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, you've given a bunch of examples that I think are illustrative of that fact. And yeah, we know why they happen now. There's no surprises anymore. Like when I look at student research now, I think, well, we already know. We know a bunch of stuff now. So what can we do to prevent it? But we also know that too. And I think, you referenced the federal government's reports, the heads of prosecution, those 3 reports are excellent, and they look at the ways that different police departments and prosecution offices are addressing why wrongful convictions happen. So yes, we are definitely moving in the right direction. I think we need to do more, that's more preventive. I think we need to do after the fact interventions better, like our compensation scheme and our conviction review scheme. I think there we need more work. And also the fact that you have a podcast about this issue. So people are going to listen to it and they're going to think about wrongful convictions. There's far more knowledge and acceptance now of the fact that wrongful convictions happen than there was when I wrote that article in 2005. And the fact that we have platforms now and you have high profile voices like somebody like David Milgaard, who was in prison from the age of 17 to his early 40s for a murder he didn't commit, saying, we need an independent commission. I spoke to Trudeau about this. Senator Kim Pate is bringing a letter. Actually, I just signed this letter that Senator Pate is bringing to Trudeau, I think this week, saying, what are you doing about this? So there's a whole bunch of people signed it. Like, we need this independent commission. You talked about it. What's happening? So I think there's a much more knowledge that these problems happen. And I do think, we are a federation, so we have one federal control of the criminal law, and that's a good thing. So I think in terms of the states, I think we're far ahead of them in that regard.
Well, that's good to hear. So I just want to touch on Innocence Ottawa. And just wondering if you could explain what your role is with Innocence Ottawa and the mandate of Innocence Ottawa.
Okay, I've been at University of Ottawa Criminology department for 22 years, but I went back to school and I got my law degree later, and I decided that I wanted to do more work directly with the wrongly convicted. So I started Innocence Ottawa in 2012. and it is a student-run group. So I have law students and criminology students. We probably about 15 or so every year. And some stay on for many years, even after they've graduated. And what we do is we take applications from people who are wrongly convicted, and we try to help them make an application for conviction review. And as we talked about earlier, the bar is very high. So we have to have fresh evidence, wasn't previously considered by the courts, and all of their appeals exhausted, right? So we turn away more people than we take, way more people. And we, so far in 8 years, we've had one case we've investigated to the extent that we put together a conviction review and sent it to the CCRG at the Department of Justice. And it's been there for 2 years almost, and we're awaiting a decision on that. So I'm really proud of the work the students do. They work really, really hard, and it's very frustrating work. And the one case that we have in front of the CCRG, it took 5 years of work. And so I had students who were undergrads, 2 students, and that worked on it through their undergrad, and they both did a master's degree with me. And they were both involved even a year after they graduated because they were so devoted to it. So I'm really proud of the work the students do, and they're great. And we've now started to do fundraising because we don't get any money budget from anybody, right? Like, we used to be a club and we got a small budget, but now they don't do that at the school anymore. So we're doing fundraising. I guess I can plug this. You said I plug. Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we have an Instagram page, Innocence Ottawa, but we have a website, www.innocenceottawa.ca, and we will be selling masks with our logo on them. We're just setting up the whole how to buy them online. So that in a couple of weeks should be up and running. And it's February now we're talking. So by the time this airs, you may not need masks anymore. Hopefully we won't always. So we'll have other things too, because that's, to be honest, bake sales and t-shirts is how we were getting our funding, because we don't need a ton of money, but if we want to go visit a prisoner in, Kingston, we need to drive there.
Right.
Or if, transcripts sometimes cost money, or, mail, all of this, just things like that. That's really what we use the money for.
Can people donate as well? Or is it?
Yes, there's a donate button. Yeah, there's a donate button. Thing is that we probably have about 5 cases on average that we're working on at any given time. But, and we don't like to give up, right? We don't like to give up because we really want to help people. But it's, with COVID too, we had a whole bunch of prison visits set up and we couldn't make them because we weren't allowed in. And so there's, it's hard work. Like, it's, the idea of it's kind of exciting, and let's be on the steps with the person when they're exonerated in front of the press. But the work that goes into that is unbelievable.
Yeah, I can imagine there's lots of hard work, and it would be fulfilling work, but I understand too that how it could be frustrating with just the amount of time and effort and hoops that you have to go through, but it's important work. So good on you guys for doing it.
So one thing I just want to say, sorry to interrupt you, is that students, like I was talking about, like a student last week who is so frustrated, like we'll see evidence maybe that we think is very clearly evidence of exoneration, but because perhaps it was raised on appeal in a way that really didn't do it justice, we can't raise it again. So it's very frustrating. And I know the people at the CCRG too talk about that. They'll have a case and they'll say, it sure looks like they're innocent, but if we can't get fresh evidence, there's nothing we can do. So it's the realities of the criminal justice system writ large when you work on wrongful conviction cases. And the problem is too, like the more, seasoned organizations like Innocence Canada, which used to be called AIDWIC in Toronto, there's a 2 to 3 year wait for them to look at a case. So they often send cases to us, and we will, like they're sending us a case right now of a man who's now just served his 25 years in prison for a murder that he says he didn't commit, and they weren't able to do anything. We'll see what we can do. Because I think a lot of people have been pleased with the recent development in the Vicky Balmora case that used familial DNA to figure out who actually killed Christine Jessup, that poor little girl that died. And I think, we're hoping with this case that we've been given by Innocence Canada, maybe because there's DNA in this case. It's inconclusive. Maybe we can find, who knows? We don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's promising though. Hopefully.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll definitely put the links on in our show notes. Yeah, for sure, because it's great work, and good on you guys again for doing it. It's important.
Thanks.
So in closing, I do want to talk about you're also getting involved in the podcast world, and it's been an adventure for me, and still a work in progress here as I figure this new environment out. But can you tell us a little bit about your podcast and what your the topic is?
And I came up, I spoke to my producer. I said I was going to be on your, and we've come up with a date of April 3rd. We hope it will be up and running. It's already finished, but it's only made available to students, but we're hoping by April 3rd it'll be online. We have a website too, which will make that available as well. Okay. Now, I became interested in this case a few years ago because I think this is a wrongful execution. And it's an older case. The man who was hanged was named Wilbert Coffin, and he's from the Gaspé in Quebec. And this case, if you went to law school, you probably know the Roncarelli versus Duplessis case, which was a Jehovah's Witness case. And Duplessis was a premier of Quebec who I think was very much behind this particular wrongful conviction. Now, I got a small grant I was going to make a documentary film about the case, and I went to the Gaspé. I've been there a few times, and I've interviewed people. Now, this case is really old. Wilbert Coffin was hanged in 1956 because we don't have a death penalty anymore. I think he was the fourth last person hanged in this case, but in Canada. And it just really bothered me because I felt like the more I read about it, it was like this injustice thing that goes off in me. And it's like, this guy, I don't think he did it. And so I was lucky to meet a lot of really interesting people in the Gaspé, many who were related to him or remember the case. And what's really striking too is anywhere you go in that little town, like I would, pizzeria or gas station, and they'd say, oh, what are you doing here? And I'd say, oh, I'm here researching the Wilbert Coffin case. And everyone would say, oh, he was innocent. So that feeling is still there 60 years after the fact, more than that. So in the end, I collected so much information. I thought, I don't have enough time to do the documentary now, so why don't I start with a podcast? So what I've done is I talk about the facts, but I intersperse that like with excerpts from my interviews and from my film interviews and my audio interviews that I've done. And in his case, just to give you some of the factual information, was there were 3 hunters from the USA who were in that part of Quebec hunting. And Wilbert Coffin, who was kind of a happy-go-lucky guy, didn't have a regular job all the time, a bit of slightly marginalized, I would think. And he was staking claims in the woods for mining, because that area of Quebec, there was a copper mining was huge there for a long time. Murdochville, the whole town was built around that. So he's in the woods and he comes across these 3 American hunters, a man, his son, and his son's friend. So Eugene Lindsay's 45, the son is 18, the friend is like 19, something like that. And they'd driven up from Pennsylvania in this crappy old truck, and it broke down. So they're like, I've been in the Gaspé Woods. It is like, even today, it's like thick bush. You can't get through. It's very, very isolated. There's cell phone reception, forget. Not that they had them back then, but it's a very isolated place. Beautiful, though. You have the mountains on one side and the ocean on the other side. So they're in the bush. They see Wilbert Coffin. He says, the man, Eugene Lindsay says, would you mind driving back to town with my son to get a new heat pump or water pump for the car? So Wilbert Coffin takes his son 4 hours back into Gaspé, gets the part, brings him back. When he arrives back, the father is there, the father's friend, and there's 2 other Americans there. He has dinner with them, and then he's leaving to finish his prospecting. Eugene Lindsay says, on your way back to Gaspé, I know you're going to be going back in 2 days. You mind dropping by and make sure that everything's okay. So he comes by, nobody's there. And where his mistake was that he stole some objects from their truck. And that's how he became a suspect a month later, when they never showed up back in Pennsylvania. And a search party happened, and they didn't find the full bodies. They found body parts because the bears had torn them apart. And he ended up being a suspect, and then ultimately convicted for the murder of one of them, where there was a bullet hole that they had evidence for. The other 2, there was no head on one of them. Like, they didn't have evidence to convict anyone, but he hanged for that in 1956. Now, he fought that tooth and nail, but there were a lot of things that went against him. He was an English speaker in a French area. His trial was supposed to be bilingual. It wasn't. his lawyer was essentially appointed by Duplessis, and he was horrible. And what happened was, and that's, I mean, I can't even imagine what that would have been like for him. So the Crown presents their case, defense stands up. He stands up, he says defense rests. He presents no defense. So, I mean, it was inevitable he'd be convicted. So there are many people today who still feel that he was wrongly convicted and wrongly executed. So that's kind of what I do in the podcast. I go over like all of that. Like I have six episodes, and then a couple of extra like special episodes. And it was really fun doing it. I really had it's a great experience to do a podcast. I need to write some academic stuff about the case now after too. I want to make some connections between the politics of the time and how, because what happened too at that time is that the hunting industry in Quebec was huge, and the Americans used that part of Quebec often. Like, just to give you an example, the Pennsylvania Hunters Association had like 170,000 members, and they would often go to Quebec. So there's a lot of money attached to that tourism, and many people think that was what motivated the government to try to find somebody quickly to pay for this crime, and that it has all the hallmarks of a wrongful conviction that we see today. So that, in that sense, I find it's a very, even though it happened a long time ago, you can't exonerate a dead man,
right?
So, but still, I think for his family, it's really, one of his sisters is still alive. She's 90 years old, and he would have been 100 and something. So, and it's still a very personal, sad thing for her that her brother, and we had a conference on it in 2019, just on that case, Canada, wrongful convictions and the death penalty. And I invited her to come, and it was very, very emotional for her. We had a lawyer from Innocence Canada who had done some work on the case, but just very frustrating because, it's too late. It's too long ago for really anything to happen. But I think it's important historically for people to know about it.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with it until you mentioned his name, and then I did some reading on it. It's certainly a fascinating and tragic case. So I'm excited to listen to your podcast. It'll be great to get the full insight and info on it. And April 3rd, right? 2021.
Hope so. That's what we're aiming for.
Fingers crossed. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Well, as I said, link everything we talked about in our show notes, your podcast, your book, the website for Innocent Canada, and encourage people to check those things out. Kathryn, I know we've gone over time here a little bit, but it's been great speaking with you. And there's so many things I'd love to get your insights and thoughts on. So maybe down the road.
I'd love to, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's been great. And I can't thank you enough for coming on today.
And thanks so much for asking me, Trevor. It's been really, really interesting for me. I love talking about these issues. I've been thinking about them, writing about them for so long now. And to find out someone who's equally interested, it's great. So thank you